I'd like to start by thanking Nestle Nutrition Institute for the organizing such an important session and for the invitation to be here. And I would certainly like to thank you people who are here. I can't believe that we have standing room only in the back. So thank you very much for your interest and commitment to nutrition of children throughout the world. Such a very, very important topic. Okay. Very good. This is an outline. We'll talk some about the life course of early development. Then we'll talk about various phases from a preconception and prenatal phase. We'll talk about breastfeeding, stunting, as I promised, nutritional deficiencies, some about food insecurity, feeding behavior, and then some recommendations. So stay tuned. When we think about children's development, we think about the life course that this takes. And you can see that it starts at conception and then moves up to birth and then continues on through childhood, adolescence, and adulthood, and then into the next generation. And there are various nutritional components that contribute to the life course. And this is when things go well. So if we start thinking about what happens from a preconception perspective, there's a strong rationale to ensure that nutritional adequacy in both males and females occurs prior to conception. There are several trials in the field. And there are some controversies regarding the appropriate timing and measures of child development. But what it seems to show is that preconceptional nutritional adequacy then has payoffs in children's neonatal status in terms of their growth, and there's some evidence that their early development also benefits from that. If we think about prenatal maternal nutrition, there are some trials that have looked at early development, particularly one from Bangladesh that showed early development, a condition of mother's nutrition during their pregnancy. So these are also, it's important for us in terms of early child development to recognize that what happens prior to birth has an impact on not only children's growth, but also their early development. So what are some of the mechanisms moving into breastfeeding? What are some of the mechanisms that we think link breastfeeding and cognition? Well, we think that the content of the breast milk is important, and there are some sessions on that here, and that's looking at DHA. The other aspects is that we also think that the process of feeding at the breast, you'll notice that there are several people walking around with babies in a skin-to-skin contact. In fact, if you would like to try that, there's an opportunity to do that, to simulate kangaroo care. But we think that the skin-to-skin contact may be one of the mechanisms that helps with the breastfeeding. So those studies, it's very hard to study breastfeeding because some of these processes are confounded. And then there are some studies that look at the process of feeding breast milk from a bottle. So when we look at the breastfeeding research, the questions have to do with exclusivity versus mixed feeding. So there's much to study or to learn from breastfeeding, which has been a very impactful intervention globally. We also look at the duration. So one of the studies that too fast. There's a very impressive meta-analysis that was published several years ago that reviewed 17 studies of breastfeeding and finds an association between the breastfeeding and enhanced cognitive development of approximately 3 points. And when you controlled for maternal IQ, they also found beneficial effects on children's IQ. So stay tuned, I'll tell you what that means in a moment. Then there's a very impressive 30-year follow-up from Brazil done by Cesar Victoria. He was able to follow children who had been breastfed in pelotas, and then at age 30 looked at the IQ of those who had been breastfed basically by duration. And what you see is that those who were breastfed for a longer duration, and that's the purple box, as opposed to those who had not been breastfed, which is the blue box on the left. The purple box is the fourth one in case the colors are dull. And you see an advantage in the children's IQ. He also found an advantage in education and in earning capacity. This is the advantage in schooling, and I don't think I included the one on earning capacity. And then finds that the mechanism or the mediation worked from the impact on income worked by the advantage to IQ. So the question that people often ask me is, are small gains in IQ really important? What do 3 IQ points mean for an individual? Well, for an individual, it probably does not mean a lot. But when you think of a population, it does mean a lot, because what happens is the distribution shifts. And that means that we have fewer people at the left end of the distribution. So a shift in a distribution can be very meaningful. So the economists will tell us that each IQ point increases lifetime earnings. So if you are wondering about the impact of a few IQ points, remember it's the distribution shift that is meaningful. Moving into stunting, we know that's defined as 2 standard deviations below the median, and at times this is present at birth, thus the focus on prenatal and preconception nutrition. The long-term consequences of stunting are related to multiple areas: growth, cognition, economic productivity, and data will show that it continues into the next generation. These are data illustrating that in multiple data sets have shown that children who are stunted prior to age 2 are at risk for not doing so well in school, so academic consequences. So, which is what this is telling us. So what are the long-term effects of stunting? Well, they impact human capital, and these have been shown, again, it's stunting prior to age 2 rather than stunting at age 4 or age 6. So it's that very, very early time in development that is so critical. This illustrates the impact of mothers who have been stunted or not stunted as infants early in life. And again, you can see the stunted mothers are on the left, the blue, and the non-stunted are on the right, the red, and the non-stunted mothers have better IQ scores. Stunting prior to age 2. So there's a 2-generation impact of this. I'm going to talk a bit about nutritional deficiencies. What's important when we think of nutritional deficiencies, not surprising, is the timing of when it occurs. So there are sensitive periods in our development, and then the severity of how severe the nutritional deficiency is, and the duration, how long it lasts. And then the thought of, is there recovery from the deficiency? So macronutrients, as we know, the carbohydrates and proteins and fats and cholesterol are necessary for growth, and you heard a bit about those in Dr. Datillo's talk. I'll talk a little bit about the micronutrients. They are important because there are specific functions associated with the micronutrients. These are vitamins and minerals that are not made by the body, but are acquired through food. So the concern is that a poor diet quality, that's one with low fruits and vegetables, or low animal source food, then increases the risk for micronutrient deficiencies. This is in some ways a hidden problem because micronutrients are not so related to growth. So you cannot tell by looking at particularly a child whether they're micronutrient deficient or not. If we think about iodine, iodine is essential to neurodevelopment. The risk of a severe iodine deficiency during pregnancy, again, during that time of early brain development, can actually lead to cretinism. A 2018 review showed that iodine deficiency was related to intellectual disability and to attention deficit disorder. So it certainly is a concern. Iodized salt is a very powerful intervention, and what we learned from the annual report on the Iodine Global Network is that the number of countries that have insufficient iodine intake has been reduced, although it continues to be a concern and a threat globally, and is probably the number one threat to children's cognition. Preventable. Iron, as we know, aids in the transport of oxygen to the brain. This is the most common nutritional deficiency globally and is a primary cause of anemia. The iron is necessary for brain development very early. It's necessary for myelination, the development of the dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine systems. And the evidence suggests that iron deficiency prior to age 2 is associated with poor development long term. Iron deficiency has been the topic of many interventions, and there's a very mixed literature in terms of the impact of interventions on prevention of iron deficiency, which is what this slide basically says. There are strategies that have been used, such as delayed cord clamping to try and ensure early iron to neonates, and concerns then about iron toxicity in terms of having too much iron, so that the iron story continues to be one that is mixed and not as clear as we might wish. This is, I thought I had one on zinc. This is a, this slide illustrates early brain development. The way that you read this is that it starts at the left with conception and then continues by month until birth, and then continues up by month to age 1, and then continues up by year. I've drawn a box around the first 1,000 days that represents conception to age 2. If we look at what's happening during that time, there's a phenomenal amount of brain development that is happening starting prior to birth. But during that first 1,000 days is synaptogenesis is coming online, myelination is occurring. So there's a phenomenal amount of brain development that happens at that time. What you see below are the iron demands. So you see the iron that's needed during the first 6 months, and then you see what's needed during the second 6 months. Now I've drawn a circle around that because the iron need is quite high at that point. And the stores of iron are basically, the stores from the mother are not there any longer. And as you heard, the diet is poor during that time. And then the iron demand goes down as the child is older and the growth goes down. So that's a very, very, very vulnerable time in early development, illustrating how important the timing is. When I show this slide, I always ask the audience to find their own age on the slide. Can you see your age off to the right? And what's happening in our brains right now? Maybe some hunger pains, but that's it. Nothing else. Okay. So the time, if we're interested in brain development, when would we invest? Very early in life. During that first 1,000 days, we would start. This is zinc, which is enzymes involved in many of the major metabolic pathways. The evidence linking zinc to development have not been as strong as we initially thought that they might be. Certainly, zinc is related to immune functioning and to a number of other areas, but we have not found a clear relation with cognition. Talking a little bit about food insecurity, which is, of course, a global concern. There's issues related to both quality and quantity. So with quality, in a food insecure environment, some foods are decreased, and they're typically expensive foods. So the proteins and the fruits and the vegetables. And then those are decreased. Some foods are increased, and they tend to be the starches or the noodles, so that they alleviate hunger, but they provide very little in terms of fruits, in terms of vitamins and minerals. So this is certainly a concern. And then when the quantity goes down, that's basically decreasing food. But first what happens is the quality is compromised. So this is why food insecurity has been associated with micronutrient deficiencies. If we think about poverty, when we are thinking about early child development, or we find that poverty and stunting has been used to estimate the risk of children not reaching their developmental potential. And what we have found is approximately 250 million children under age 5, or 43% of the world's population of children, do not reach their developmental potential, estimated by stunting and poverty. And this is where the children are located. You can see primarily in sub-Saharan Africa and in Asia. So what's the link between nutrition and cognition, or how does this work? What we think is there's a direct link from nutrition, but there's also a link through feeding behavior. And so we'll talk a little bit about feeding behavior. What we've learned about feeding behavior in the U.S. Comes from a pediatrician named Clara Davis in 1928, who studied children who were in what were called foundling homes or institutions. And what she did is provide food on a tray to them, and the child looked at a food, and the nurse then fed the food. So the kinds of things that she provided were non-mixed foods. So she would provide green beans or provide meat, and based then on what the children ate, she summarized that children were able to balance. So they had basic foods, they were fed, and that they self-regulated. So this was the finding. Now, it's important to notice that on the tray, they did not include chips, candy, cookies, all of the things that are in our daily obesogenic environment. All of the threats that we see surrounding us, they were not included. So this has guided the thought that children self-regulate. Well, they do, but they can be threatened by the things that are around us. WHO and UNICEF have the Infant and Young Child Feeding Guide, and this is a global strategy to help in terms of thinking about how we feed our young children. This is also part of the care for child development that is used by community health workers. We'll talk a little about responsive caregiving and responsive feeding. This is feeding that is guided by caregivers. It's nurturant, it's consistent, so there are routines, and there are responses to children. It's a partnership between children and caregivers. It works like this. So a baby whines, and the caregiver offers vegetables. The baby opens mouth, the caregiver feeds a bit. The baby fusses. So this is a baby refusing. What does the caregiver do? Well, under this situation, the caregiver pressures the child. Let's go, let's hurry, and what do we have? Not a very successful interaction. So an alternative would be, same beginning, this time, the child again says no. This time, the caregiver smiles, offers a finger food or an alternative, and the baby accepts and we move on. So it shows that feeding is a partnership, and it's caregivers learning to recognize cues from infants and then responding. There are developmental milestones during these first 2 years, during these 1,000 days, that progress very, very quickly. So early on, babies can suck and swallow. At about 6 months, they can sit, they have better head control, and they can lean forward and indicate when they're hungry. And they can reach for food, so they become interested in food. And then from 12 to 24 months or so, they're into a self-feeding. So there are lots and lots of changes that happen early in life. Caregivers are not always aware of these changes and how quickly they happen. Babies are also able to let you know from the very beginning. So, for example, this is baby's response to water, sweet, sour, or bitter. So notice, sweet, it's a bit of an upturn. Look at sour. You can detect the difference between sweet and sour. And then look at bitter. Ah! So very early on, babies are giving cues. So what we need to do is to help caregivers recognize their cues. So these are more cues. Hand sucking, leaning forward. This is a very clear cue of a child saying, I've had enough. So they can tell you their likes and dislikes. Our challenge then is to modulate our behavior so there's a dance. That's responsive feeding or responsive caregiving. So as we see, as children are increasing, the second 6 months of life is a very vulnerable time because at this point, they're into complementary food. They're able to eat complementary food. They're able to pick things off the floor and put them into their mouths. So there are challenges in terms of the hygienic aspects of their environment and the risk of illness during this time. When there are new foods, it may take as many as 20 times for a child to accept a new food. Children of this age are neophobic, meaning they're hesitant to have new foods. It's understandable that they are, but parents do better if they recognize that children learn by imitating parents and by having multiple opportunities. So what this illustrates is that we have parent-guided, and we have then transitioning into children being able to feed themselves. So what some of the recommendations are is to ensure nutritional adequacy and avoidance of making meal times adverse. And to work on responsive caregiving so children are involved in the caregiving, and to initiate interventions very, very early in life during the time of early brain development. This is consistent with nurturing care, which is what children need in terms of their very early development. It includes nutrition, health, responsive caregiving, security and safety, and early learning. And I thank you very much.